So in this presentation, I'm going to be looking at the relationship between the two major economic systems of the 20th century, socialism and capitalism. First, let's take a look at capitalism. What are some words to describe the economic system the US predominantly used in the 20th century besides capitalism? Here's what I came up with. It seems that while free enterprise dominated from about 1941 to 1974, it, like laissez-faire, is quickly becoming obsolete. Free market seems to have won out in the end. The thing that sticks out the most on the graph is the year 1945. Interestingly, here there is a dramatic spike for free enterprise, but no such spike for other terms. The obvious cause for this spike is the end of World War II and the rise of the US economically, but why only for free enterprise? Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find an answer. Now let's throw the more common word in the mix, capitalism. Here we see two major peaks, 1935 and 1977. And when we switch to American English, one of the peaks becomes much more dramatic. This confirms my suspicion that this spike is caused by the Great Depression, which America, as well as the world, was entrenched in at this time, 1935. And there's much talk about the capitalist system's viability as a whole, especially in the United States where the Depression originated. Now let's look at capitalism's antonym, socialism. I've chosen two other closely related, though not strictly synonymous terms to compare it to, communism and Marxism. What's interesting here is that unlike with capitalism and its synonyms, socialism and its synonyms tend to follow a similar trend over time. This implies that when one of these terms is being used frequently, the others will tend to be used frequently as well. Another thing to note is that the trends seen here are less volatile than was the case with capitalism, ironically, and only a few less pronounced peaks exist. The first of which that I can track down is that of around 1920. This rise is due to the First Red Scare, a period of intense fear during the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the growing labor movement in the US. What's interesting to note here is that the First Red Scare was something created largely through print with articles like you see here. I theorize that, for this reason, we don't see much of a gap between the nGrams and when this actually occurred like we would see with other events. The rest of the trends here are what we would expect. They generally follow the rise and fall of the USSR. Before we bring capitalism back into the mix, let's switch over to Russian. Compared to the English graph, this is a very different trend. The most stunning difference is how, unlike the gradual rise in Europe, there is a remarkably sharp rise in Russian. It seems that the instant the revolution broke out, all anyone was talking about was socialism. While this seems like a compelling argument, we'll see something in a bit that makes me doubt this as being the only major reason we see this. Another difference is the drop we see around 1943, just as the Germans are being pushed back in both fronts in World War II. But why would there be a drop? To me, it would seem logical for there to be an increase, if anything, since successes on the battlefield would translate to more propaganda espousing socialism in the motherland. Even more interesting, we see a slight increase on the English graph. I've not been able to find a clear cause for this. Now let's focus only on socialism and capitalism. Again, on the Russian graph, we see this odd jump around 1916 for both capitalism and socialism, which makes me a bit suspicious about my earlier argument. My suspicions are confirmed when we add two unrelated words, person and no. They show the same thing, meaning that there is something more systematic going on here. From here, I can only speculate. Is pre-revolution literature largely lost? Did the nGrams team choose only to scan post-revolutionary works? I guess I would have to ask Google in order to get an actual answer, so we'll have to leave that one unanswered. Disregarding this abrupt appearance, we can look at something interesting between the relationships of the curves. For the Russian graph, the trends are nearly identical, just vertically offset, with socialism always being more frequent than capitalism. Just what we would expect. Though this makes sense, the similarity between the two trends is a bit suspicious, so again I added a few unrelated words, book and table. So, while the trends for these words differ from those of our economic systems, they have one thing in common, that drop around 1943 that I mentioned earlier. It seems that whatever it was that caused this affected the entire lexicon, which makes it more likely that this is a result of the war itself. Because nGrams is based on percentage, the explanation cannot simply be the reduced production of print in Russia at this time, as only heavy industry was focused on. Again, I was unable to find any viable explanation for this, and further research is needed. Looking at the English graph, now we still see a correlation between the two words, but not as strongly as in the Russian graph. Just as in the Russian graph, we see that the trend for both words does exactly what we'd expect it to by following the Cold War. Both words gained steam throughout the Cold War, and just as the USSR collapses in 1991, we also see a fall for socialism while capitalism remains relatively steady. In a way, the second half of the graph actually tells us how the Cold War played out. In the places where the trends touch, the Cold War heats up. In the early 1950s, we can see the Korean War, and in the late 1970s, we can see the result of the Vietnam War. In conclusion, these graphs tell us a lot about the Cold War and differences in Western and Soviet lexicon, just by looking at a small selection of words. Perhaps more surprising are the things in these graphs that cannot be easily explained. Maybe I'm just bad at researching, or maybe nGrams is revealing something new. That's all. Thanks.